At 11:30 hours on December 22, 1944, 4 German soldiers walked under 2 white flags toward American lines outside the Belgian town of Bastogne. Major Wagner and Lieutenant Helmuth Henke led the group, accompanied by 2 enlisted men from the 901st Panzer Grenadier Regiment. They carried a typed document in German with an English translation prepared specifically for this mission. The document was an ultimatum, demanding the surrender of the American forces surrounded in Bastogne. The officers expected a formal military response, probably a request for time to consider terms, possibly a counter-proposal about prisoner treatment, perhaps even preliminary negotiations about the mechanics of surrender. They did not expect what they were about to receive. Inside Bastogne, Brigadier General Anthony Clement McAuliffe commanded the 101st Airborne Division and attached units, approximately 11,000 American soldiers, completely surrounded by German forces. McAuliffe was 46 years old, from Washington, D.C., a career artillery officer who had served as the division's artillery commander since before D-Day and had fought through Normandy, France, and Holland. He was commanding the division at Bastogne because the division commander, Major General Maxwell Taylor, was attending a staff conference in Washington, and the assistant division commander was in England. Command had fallen to McAuliffe by default. He was not a philosophical man. He was not known for clever speeches or dramatic gestures. He was known for being direct, practical, and impossible to rattle. His staff knew him as a man who rarely used profanity. When he wanted to express strong displeasure, he said, "nuts." It was part of his normal vocabulary. The situation in Bastogne was desperate by any military standard. The German offensive that would later be called the Battle of the Bulge had begun on December 16, with complete surprise. 3 German armies, over 400,000 men supported by over 1,400 tanks and armoured fighting vehicles, had smashed through weak American positions in the Ardennes forest. The goal was to split the Allied armies, capture the vital port of Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace in the west, so Germany could concentrate everything on fighting the Soviets in the east. Bastogne sat at a critical road junction. 7 major roads passed through the town, plus 1 railroad line. Whoever controlled Bastogne controlled movement through the entire region. Without Bastogne, German mechanized forces could not efficiently advance westward. The Germans needed it desperately. McAuliffe was determined they would not get it. By December 22, the situation looked hopeless to outside observers. The 101st Airborne and attached units had been rushed to Bastogne on December 18 and 19, with almost no preparation. They had travelled over 100 miles from their rest camp at Mourmelon in open trucks through freezing weather. They arrived just hours before German forces closed the ring on December 20. Now they were cut off completely. German forces outnumbered them at least 3-1, possibly more. The weather had been terrible for days. Thick fog and low clouds blanketed the Ardennes. Temperatures dropped well below freezing at night. The conditions prevented air supply drops or air support. Without aerial resupply, the Americans were running out of ammunition. Artillery units were restricted to 10 rounds per gun per day. They were running out of medical supplies. Wounded men were being treated in makeshift aid stations without adequate morphine or bandages or surgical equipment. They were desperately low on food. Men were sharing cold K rations when they had any food at all. They were wearing summer uniforms and light field jackets in sub-zero temperatures because winter gear had not arrived before the encirclement. Frostbite cases mounted daily. The German forces surrounding Bastogne included elite veteran units. The 2nd Panzer Division was there, commanded by Colonel Meinrad von Lüttwitz. Panzer Lehr Division was there under General Lieutenant Fritz Bayerlein. The 26th Volksgrenadier Division was there under General Major Heinz Kokott. These were experienced units with heavy equipment, including tanks the Americans could not match in armour or firepower. The German commander directing operations against Bastogne was General Heinrich von Lüttwitz, who commanded the 47th Panzer Corps. Von Lüttwitz was a professional career officer with decades of experience. He was confident the Americans would surrender once they understood their situation. Surrounded forces typically did when faced with overwhelming odds and no prospect of relief. It was the reasonable thing to do. It was what professional soldiers did when the tactical situation became hopeless. Von Lüttwitz had already accepted the surrender of other American units during the offensive. On December 19, 2 entire regiments of the 106th Infantry Division, surrounded at the Schnee-Eifel east of St. Vith, had negotiated surrender terms after realizing they could not break out through German lines. The 422nd and 423rd Infantry Regiments laid down their weapons. Over 7,000 American soldiers, possibly as many as 9,000, became prisoners that day. It was the largest American surrender in the European theatre of the war. Von Lüttwitz expected Bastogne to follow the same pattern. The situation was similar. American forces surrounded, outnumbered, cut off from supply and reinforcement, facing veteran German units with superior firepower. Von Lüttwitz was offering reasonable terms. His ultimatum promised honorable treatment as prisoners of war under the Geneva Convention. It warned that if the Americans refused, German artillery and air power would annihilate the town and everyone in it. The ultimatum gave the Americans 2 hours to decide. It was a generous offer under the circumstances. Von Lüttwitz expected the American commander to see reason, but von Lüttwitz did not understand who he was dealing with. He did not understand the 101st Airborne Division. He did not understand American paratroopers, men who had volunteered for the most dangerous assignments, who had trained for years to jump behind enemy lines, who had fought their way out of Normandy and across France against determined German resistance, and he especially did not understand Anthony McAuliffe. McAuliffe was not the type of officer who calculated odds and made decisions based purely on tactical mathematics. He understood that some positions had to be held regardless of the odds. Bastogne was one of those positions. The German delegation carrying the ultimatum first encountered an American outpost from F Company, 327th Glider Infantry Regiment, in the early morning. The outpost was a squad of men in a frozen foxhole on the southern edge of the American perimeter near the village of Marvy. The squad leader, a staff sergeant whose name has been lost to history, saw the white flags and immediately recognized this was not a normal combat patrol. He called for his company commander. The company commander, not wanting to make a decision about surrender negotiations on his own authority, called his battalion commander. The battalion commander called regimental headquarters. Eventually, someone decided the message should go to General McAuliffe at division headquarters. The German officers, following military protocol, were blindfolded so they could not observe American defensive positions. They stood in the snow and waited. While this was happening, Major Wagner and Lieutenant Henke waited in the December cold. They stood for over an hour, while the Americans worked the request up through their chain of command. The enlisted soldiers guarding them were curious about the surrender demand. Word spread quickly through nearby foxholes. Germans were here to accept American surrender. Some soldiers were angry at the presumption. They had been fighting for days in terrible conditions. They were hungry and cold and low on ammunition. They were holding positions against repeated German attacks, and now the Germans were suggesting they give up. The idea was insulting. These men had not come all the way from Normandy to surrender in Belgium. The ultimatum finally reached McAuliffe at his headquarters in the Heinz barracks in Bastogne around 11:30 hours. But McAuliffe was not there when it arrived. Lieutenant Colonel Ned Moore, the acting chief of staff, entered McAuliffe's sleeping quarters adjacent to the communications center. McAuliffe was resting after being up most of the night dealing with German attacks. Moore woke him and told him Germans had sent people forward. McAuliffe, still half asleep, thought initially that the Germans wanted to surrender to him. Moore quickly corrected that misunderstanding. The Germans wanted American surrender. McAuliffe became angry, which was unusual for the generally calm commander. He climbed out of his sleeping bag. Moore handed him the typed document. McAuliffe read it carefully. The document was formal and polite in the German military style. It explained that Bastogne was completely surrounded by strong German armoured units. It noted that other German forces had crossed the Arth River, had taken Marche, and reached Saint-Hubert. It claimed Liebremont was in German hands. It stated that there was only one possibility to save the encircled American troops from total annihilation, that being honourable surrender of the town. It offered a term of 2 hours to think it over, beginning from the presentation of the note. It warned that if the proposal was rejected, one German artillery corps and 6 heavy anti-aircraft battalions were ready to annihilate American troops in and near Bastogne. It stated the order for firing would be given immediately after the 2-hour term expired. It noted that serious civilian losses caused by artillery fire would not correspond with well-known American humanity. It was signed, the German commander. McAuliffe read it once, looked up at Moore, and said one word. The word was nuts. Then he dropped the paper on the floor and started to leave headquarters. He told Moore he was going to congratulate a unit that had destroyed a German roadblock earlier that morning. He walked out as if the German ultimatum was not worth another moment of his time. Moore realized the general was serious about leaving. Moore called out that the Germans were still waiting for a formal written reply. McAuliffe stopped. He turned back and said they were not getting one. Moore pointed out that military protocol required some kind of official response to a surrender demand. You could not just ignore it. The Germans had sent officers under a flag of truce. International military convention required an answer. The Germans were entitled to a response. McAuliffe thought about it for a moment. Then he asked what they should tell the Germans. Moore suggested they write something official and formal, explaining that the American forces had no intention of surrendering and would continue to resist all attacks. McAuliffe shook his head. That was too much effort and too many words. The Germans wanted a reply. He had already given them one. Nuts. That was the reply. Send them that. Moore was not sure if McAuliffe was serious. Neither was Lieutenant Colonel Harry W. O. Kinnard, the division operations officer, who had joined them in the room. Kinnard asked if McAuliffe really wanted to send nuts as the official reply to a German surrender ultimatum from a Panzer Corps commander. McAuliffe said absolutely. It was the first word that came to mind when he read their ridiculous demand. It perfectly expressed what he thought about the situation and about their presumption. If the Germans wanted a fancy, formal reply with diplomatic language and military courtesies, they were out of luck. This was the reply. Nuts. Kinnard pointed out that nuts might not translate well into German. The German officers might not understand American slang. They might not know what the word meant. McAuliffe said that was their problem, not his. Kinnard and Moore looked at each other. They both realized McAuliffe was completely serious. He was actually going to send a one-word reply, in American slang, to a formal German military ultimatum. It violated every standard of military communication they had ever learned. It was probably against about a dozen regulations. It was definitely not how professional armies were supposed to conduct official negotiations about surrender terms. It was also perfectly McAuliffe. Direct, informal, unintimidated, not wasting words on something that did not deserve consideration. Someone typed up the reply on official division letterhead. The format was simple and centered on the page. It read, "To the German commander, nuts, the American commander." The word nuts was typed in capital letters with an exclamation point, 4 words total. The shortest official military communication anyone in the division had ever seen. Someone needed to deliver the reply to the German officers who were still waiting at F Company's position. That job fell to Colonel Joseph H. Harper, commander of the 327th Glider Infantry Regiment. Harper was the senior officer in whose sector the German delegation was waiting. When Harper arrived at division headquarters to collect the official reply, Lieutenant Colonel Kinnard handed him the typed message. Harper read it. He looked at Kinnard with a puzzled expression. He asked if this was some kind of joke. Kinnard assured him it was not. General McAuliffe had been very clear. This was the official reply of the American commander to the German surrender demand. Harper asked how he was supposed to deliver this to German officers, who probably spoke limited English, and definitely would not understand American slang. What was he supposed to say when they asked what it meant? What was he supposed to do if they demanded clarification? Kinnard thought about it for a moment. Then he said Harper should tell them it meant the same as go to hell. Just tell them that. Harper nodded slowly. He understood what he needed to do. He took the typed message and headed back to his jeep. Before Harper left, McAuliffe had one more instruction. He told Harper to make it as tough as he could when delivering the message. Let the Germans know exactly how the Americans felt about their demand. The drive back to F Company's command post took about 20 minutes. Harper used the time to think about how to handle this unusual assignment. He was about to deliver what amounted to an insult, disguised as an official military communication, to representatives of an enemy army that currently surrounded and outnumbered his forces. The situation required careful handling. The Germans might take offense. They might interpret the reply as mockery of German military honor. They might become angry. Angry enemies sometimes did unpredictable and violent things. On the other hand, Harper understood exactly what McAuliffe was accomplishing. The reply was not really about the Germans. It was about the Americans. Every soldier in Bastogne would hear about this within hours. They would hear that when the Germans demanded surrender, their general told them nuts. The men would understand what that meant. It meant their commander was not worried. It meant he was not considering surrender even for a moment. It meant he had complete confidence they would hold the town. That message would matter to tired, cold, hungry soldiers who were starting to wonder if they could actually survive this encirclement. Harper reached the position where Major Wagner and Lieutenant Henke waited. They were still blindfolded, still standing in the snow. They had been waiting for over 2 hours now. They straightened when they heard American voices approaching. Harper told them they could remove their blindfolds. They did. Wagner spoke decent English. Henke spoke some English as well. They expected to be escorted to division headquarters for formal negotiations about surrender terms, or at least to receive a written document outlining American conditions and concerns. Wagner asked in formal English if the American commander was ready to discuss surrender terms. Harper said no. There would be no discussion of surrender. The American commander had sent a reply. He handed Wagner the typed piece of paper. Wagner took it carefully. He read it slowly. His face showed confusion. He looked at Henke. Henke looked over Wagner's shoulder at the message. They both stared at it for a long moment. Wagner looked back at Harper and asked in careful English what this word meant. What was this nuts? He had studied English, but had never encountered this particular word used in this way. Was it a military term? Was it some kind of code? Harper said he would explain. He said the official written reply from the American commander was nuts. Wagner asked again what that meant in German. His English vocabulary was good for military matters, but this was slang he did not know. Harper paused for effect. He wanted to make sure the German officers understood this clearly. Then he said that if they did not understand what nuts meant in plain American English, then he could provide a translation. In plain English, it meant the same as, go to hell. Go to hell and take your surrender demand with you. There was a moment of silence. Wagner and Henke stared at Harper. Harper stared back. He kept his face completely neutral and professional. He was delivering an official military communication, and he delivered it with the same military courtesy he would use for any formal message between commanders. But the message itself was unmistakable. The Americans were not surrendering. They were not negotiating. They were rejecting the entire premise of the German ultimatum. Wagner tried to continue the conversation. He said he did not think the American commander understood the seriousness of the military situation. The German forces surrounding Bastogne were overwhelming in number and firepower. The Americans were completely cut off from supply and reinforcement. The weather prevented air support. Continued resistance would result in the complete destruction of the American garrison and the town itself. Surely the American commander understood his responsibility to his men and to the civilians in Bastogne. Surely he did not want unnecessary casualties when the outcome was inevitable. Harper cut him off. He said the American commander understood the situation perfectly well. That was exactly why the reply was nuts. The American commander was not interested in German assessments of the military situation. He was not interested in German predictions about what would happen. He was definitely not interested in surrendering. Then Harper said something else. He said he was going to give the Germans some advice. He said they had better attack right now if they wanted to take Bastogne. They had better do it immediately, because soon the weather was going to clear. When the weather cleared, the American Air Force would arrive. When that happened, the Germans would not have much time left. It was a bluff, but Harper delivered it with absolute conviction. The weather had been terrible for days. There was no sign of it clearing. But Harper spoke as if he knew something the Germans did not. Wagner and Henke looked at each other. They could not tell if Harper was bluffing or if he actually knew something about weather forecasts and air operations. The confidence in his voice was unsettling. Harper then told them their time was up. The 2-hour deadline the Germans had set in their ultimatum had expired. The discussion was over. The American reply was final. He would escort them back to German lines personally. Harper signaled to the soldiers who had brought the German delegation in. The soldiers formed up around Wagner and Henke. The German officers were blindfolded again for the walk back to their lines. Harper and his men escorted them through American positions to the forward edge. At the boundary between American and German territory, the blindfolds were removed. Harper told them to go. Wagner tried one more time to speak. Harper told him there was nothing more to say. The American answer was nuts. If they did not understand that, they could explain it to their commanding general. The Germans were dismissed. Wagner and Henke walked back across no man's land toward their own lines. Harper watched them go. He then returned to his command post and reported to division headquarters that the German surrender demand had been officially rejected and the German delegation had been returned to their lines. The time was approximately 1400 hours, 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Wagner and Henke returned to their command post at Panzer Division headquarters. They carried the piece of paper with the one-word reply and a story about an American colonel who had essentially told them to go to hell with complete military formality. They encountered General Hasso von Manteuffel, commander of the 5th Panzer Army, who happened to be visiting forward headquarters. Wagner reported what had happened. Von Manteuffel was surprised and disturbed. He had not authorized any surrender ultimatum to Bastogne. His orders were for panzer divisions to bypass Bastogne and continue the westward advance toward the Meuse River. The infantry divisions would contain and eventually capture Bastogne. Sending a formal surrender demand implied Bastogne was being given priority attention, which was not part of the plan. Von Manteuffel was irritated that von Lüttwitz had acted without proper authorization. Wagner and Henke then reported to General von Lüttwitz at 47th Panzer Corps headquarters. Von Lüttwitz read the American reply. He asked what it meant. Wagner explained that the American colonel had translated it as equivalent to go to hell. The Americans were rejecting surrender completely. Von Lüttwitz studied the paper. He was not sure how to interpret this response. Was it genuine defiance based on confidence? Was it bravado covering desperation? Was it the reply of a commander who genuinely believed his forces could hold out until relief arrived? German intelligence officers at Corps headquarters analyzed the American response. They tried to understand the psychology behind it. A formal military rejection would have been normal and expected. Negotiations about terms would have been understandable. Even an angry refusal would have made sense. But this casual dismissal, this slang insult delivered as if the entire German ultimatum was beneath serious consideration, was something they had not encountered before in this war. Some German officers thought it showed the Americans did not truly understand their desperate situation. They were surrounded, outnumbered, undersupplied, and cut off from relief. Rational commanders in that situation at least considered surrender seriously. The flippant reply suggested either ignorance of military reality or irrational optimism. Other German officers thought it showed dangerous confidence. The American commander was clearly not worried about the outcome. That might mean he knew something the Germans did not. Maybe American relief forces were closer than German intelligence believed. Maybe American supplies were better than estimated. Maybe the American defensive position was much stronger than it appeared. Maybe the Americans had information about weather clearing and air support arriving. What the German officers did not fully understand at that moment was the psychological purpose of McAuliffe's reply. It was not really directed at the Germans. It was directed at his own troops, and it was already working. Within hours of Harper's return to American lines, every soldier in the Bastogne perimeter knew about the reply. The story spread through foxholes and command posts and aid stations like wildfire. Soldiers told each other about how the Germans had demanded surrender, and General McAuliffe had replied with a one-word insult. The colonel, delivering the message, had told the Germans to go to hell and warned them to attack soon because the American Air Force was coming. The effect on American morale was immediate and powerful. These men had been fighting in desperate conditions for days. They were exhausted from constant alerts and sporadic attacks. They were cold beyond anything most of them had experienced. They were hungry, subsisting on minimal rations. They were running low on ammunition and medical supplies. Some had privately started to wonder if surrender might be the sensible option when the situation became truly hopeless. Then they heard their commanding general, thought the German surrender demand was so ridiculous, the only appropriate response was an American slang insult. The message was unmistakable. McAuliffe was not considering surrender. He was not worried about the German forces surrounding them. He was so confident in his troops' ability to hold the town that he could afford to be dismissive and insulting to a German general. If the general was that confident, maybe the situation was not as hopeless as it seemed. If the general believed they could hold out, maybe they actually could. The psychological impact spread through every unit in the garrison. The 327th Glider Infantry Regiment heard it. The 501st Parachute Infantry Regiment heard it. The 502nd and 506th Parachute Infantry Regiments heard it. The 969th Field Artillery Battalion, an African-American unit that had fought with distinction, heard it. The 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion heard it. Combat Command B of the 10th Armored Division heard it. Every unit in the perimeter heard about nuts. They heard about Harper telling the Germans they better attack soon because the Air Force was coming. The stories improved with each retelling. By evening, some versions had McAuliffe laughing when he gave the reply. Some versions had Harper threatening the German officers. None of it was exactly accurate, but all of it served the same purpose. It turned a desperate defensive stand into something the Americans could be proud of. It gave them a story they could tell themselves about who they were and what they were doing. Then, on December 23, something remarkable happened. The weather cleared. For the first time in over a week, the fog lifted. The clouds broke apart. Blue sky appeared. The temperature was still brutally cold, but visibility improved dramatically. American soldiers in their foxholes looked up and saw something they had been waiting for. Aircraft. American aircraft. The first aerial resupply mission arrived around noon on December 23. 241 C-47 transport aircraft flew over Bastogne in formations, the sky filled with colored parachutes as supplies dropped. Ammunition bundles fell. Medical supply canisters descended. Food containers drifted down. Bundles of winter clothing dropped into the perimeter. The aircraft faced German anti-aircraft fire but kept coming. They made their drops and turned for home. Approximately 95% of the supplies landed inside American lines and were recovered. 144 tons of supplies reached the defenders. It was not everything they needed, but it was enough. Enough ammunition to keep fighting. Enough medical supplies to treat the wounded. Enough food so men were not starving. Enough to keep holding. But the aerial resupply was only part of what the clear weather brought. It also brought fighter bombers. American P-47 Thunderbolts arrived over Bastogne and began attacking German positions. They strafed German troops in the open. They bombed German artillery positions. They attacked German supply columns. Harper had not been bluffing after all. The American Air Force had arrived exactly as he said it would. The psychological impact on both sides was profound. American soldiers who had been wondering if they could survive suddenly had hope. The supplies meant they could keep fighting. The air support meant they were not alone. Help was coming. German soldiers who had been confident about overwhelming the garrison suddenly faced a changed tactical situation. American fighter bombers were dangerous. German forces in the open were vulnerable. German supply lines were exposed to air attack. The weather clearing changed everything. Von Lüttwitz ordered renewed attacks on December 23. German infantry, supported by tanks, hit the American perimeter from multiple directions. The attacks were fierce and sustained. American positions came under heavy artillery fire, followed by infantry assault. The defenders fought back with everything they had. Machine gun positions held their ground. Artillery batteries fired at German formations. Tank destroyers engaged German tanks at close range. The Americans held. They were helped by the air support that hammered German staging areas and supply routes. They were helped by the resupplied ammunition that let them fire without counting every round. They were helped by the simple fact that they believed they could win. The attacks continued through December 24 and into Christmas Day. German forces made determined efforts to break the American perimeter. They achieved some local penetrations, but could not sustain them. American counterattacks drove them back. The fighting was brutal and close range. Men fought house to house in some sectors, but the perimeter held. The critical road junction remained in American hands. While the defenders of Bastogne held against German attacks, American forces outside the encirclement were moving to break through. General George Patton had accomplished something military planners thought impossible. He had taken his entire Third Army, over 200,000 men, and turned it 90 degrees from its eastward advance. In terrible winter weather, over icy roads, through freezing temperatures, he had reoriented his entire force and driven it north toward Bastogne. The operation was a masterpiece of logistics and leadership. Units moved day and night, supply columns struggled through snow and ice, infantry marched in conditions that caused widespread frostbite, but they kept moving. The spearhead of Patton's relief force was the 4th Armored Division commanded by Major General Hugh Gaffey. Leading the 4th Armored was Combat Command B under Brigadier General Holmes Dager, and leading Combat Command B was the 37th Tank Battalion, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, Jr. Abrams was an aggressive tank commander who led from the front in his Sherman tank named Thunderbolt 4. His famous order to his battalion before the final push was simple: "We are going into those people now. Let her roll." The 37th Tank Battalion fought its way north against determined German resistance. They encountered roadblocks. They fought through German defensive positions. They took casualties, but they kept advancing. On December 26, Company C of the 37th Tank Battalion, led by First Lieutenant Charles P. Boggess, in an M4A3E2 Sherman assault tank named Cobra King, broke through the final German positions south of Bastogne. At approximately 4:50 in the afternoon, Boggess made contact with forward elements of the 101st Airborne Division. First Lieutenant Dwayne Webster of the 326th Airborne Engineer Battalion shook hands with Boggess. At 5:10, Lieutenant Colonel Abrams personally shook hands with Brigadier General McAuliffe. The siege of Bastogne was broken. The relief of Bastogne did not end the Battle of the Bulge. Fighting continued for weeks, but Bastogne had held. The critical road junction remained in American hands. The German offensive had been delayed and disrupted. The delay gave Allied forces time to regroup and counterattack. By January, the German offensive had failed completely. The Wehrmacht had committed its last reserves and lost them. Germany would never mount another offensive in the West. McAuliffe's reply became famous. American newspapers picked up the story in late December. The headline practically wrote itself. American general tells Germans nuts when they demand surrender. It was exactly the kind of story Americans wanted to hear. Their boys were surrounded and outnumbered, but they did not give up. They did not even dignify the enemy demand with a serious response. They told the Germans nuts and then held their ground until relief arrived. It fit perfectly with American self-image. Brave, defiant, informal, refusing to be intimidated by superior forces or military protocol. The story reached Winston Churchill in early January 1945. Churchill was fascinated. He asked his staff to explain what nuts meant in American slang. His staff explained it was informal language, expressing complete rejection, roughly equivalent to rubbish or nonsense. Churchill loved it. He later wrote that the Battle of the Bulge was undoubtedly the greatest American battle of the war and possibly the greatest action in history. He specifically mentioned McAuliffe's reply as an example of American spirit. The British Prime Minister, who was famous for his own way with words, appreciated the psychological power of the single-word response. The story had a particular impact on German prisoners of war. American interrogators asked captured German officers about Bastogne. Many mentioned the surrender ultimatum and the American reply. Some admitted they had not understood what nuts meant at the time. Some said they thought it showed the Americans were not taking the situation seriously, which had been confusing. Some said in retrospect they realized it showed the Americans were absolutely determined not to surrender, which should have been taken as a warning. One captured German major said the reply had bothered him because it suggested the Americans were fighting a different kind of war. German military communication was formal and proper. The Americans were informal and direct. That reflected different cultures and different approaches to warfare. The German major said his army had underestimated how effective the American approach could be. McAuliffe himself did not think the reply was particularly significant at the time. When asked about it later, he said it was just the first thing that came to mind. He had not planned it. He had not thought it through. The Germans had sent a ridiculous demand, and he had given them a direct answer. That was all. He was mildly surprised when the story became famous. He was more proud of how his troops had fought than of any clever reply. Harper thought the reply was brilliant, not because of what it said to the Germans, but because of what it did for American morale. Harper understood that leadership in desperate situations was partly about projecting confidence. McAuliffe's casual dismissal of the German ultimatum had projected absolute confidence. The troops had responded to that confidence. They had believed their general knew they could hold out, and because they believed it, they did hold out. Harper later said the reply might have been spontaneous, but it had exactly the right effect, at exactly the right time. The soldiers who fought at Bastogne remembered the reply for the rest of their lives. Veterans of the 101st Airborne told the story to their children and grandchildren. It became part of the division's identity. The 101st Airborne was the unit whose general told the Germans nuts. That defined them. It set them apart. It was a source of pride. Reunion groups used it as a motto. Monuments included it. It became shorthand for the entire battle. You could say, nuts, and every World War II veteran knew exactly what you meant. Bastogne. Outnumbered, held anyway, American. German veterans who had fought around Bastogne had a more complicated relationship with the story. Some respected it as an example of effective psychological warfare. Some resented it as an insult to their military honor. Some found it amusing in retrospect, a perfect example of the cultural gap between German and American forces. One German veteran, interviewed in the 1980s, said the reply had been the moment he realized Germany might actually lose the war, not because of the word itself, but because of what it represented. The Americans were so confident they could afford to be insulting. That confidence turned out to be justified. The Battle of the Bulge was the last major German offensive of the war. After the offensive failed, Germany was purely defensive for the remaining months. The Wehrmacht had committed massive resources to the Ardennes offensive and lost them. Tank losses were irreplaceable. Fuel consumption had been enormous, and fuel was desperately scarce. Casualties were high. The Luftwaffe had committed aircraft and lost them. Germany had nothing left for another strategic offensive. From January 1945 onward, the question was not whether Germany would lose, but how long it would take. Bastogne became a symbol. It represented the moment when American forces proved they could take the best the Wehrmacht could deliver and still hold. Earlier battles had shown Americans could attack successfully. Bastogne showed they could defend successfully even when surrounded and outnumbered. That mattered. It proved American forces had reached the same level of tactical competence as veteran German units. The Wehrmacht could no longer assume American forces would break under pressure. McAuliffe received the Distinguished Service Cross for his leadership at Bastogne. The 101st Airborne received a Presidential Unit Citation. Harper was promoted. Kinnard continued serving and eventually became a lieutenant general. Moore stayed in the army and had a successful career. The soldiers who held the foxholes and fought off German attacks received whatever medals their specific actions warranted, but mostly they received the knowledge that they had held when it mattered most. McAuliffe stayed in the army after the war. He commanded the 103rd Infantry Division. He served in various staff positions. He eventually became commander of United States Army Europe. He retired as a full general in 1956. He died in 1975 at age 77. His obituary in the New York Times led with the story of nuts. That one word defined his legacy more than anything else he did in a long military career. The piece of paper with the original typed reply to the German ultimatum survived the war. It ended up in the National Archives. Historians confirmed it was authentic. The message really did consist of 4 words. To the German commander, nuts, the American commander. No elaboration, no explanation, just the single-word response and the signatures. It remains one of the most famous military communications in American history. The site of the German surrender demand is marked today. A monument stands near where Wagner and Henke approached American lines under their white flag. The monument quotes McAuliffe's reply, "Tourists visit it, veterans visit it, people take photographs next to the word nuts carved in stone." The monument does not explain the context in detail. It does not need to. Everyone who visits knows the story. The people of Bastogne remember the battle and the siege. The town hosts commemorations every December. Veterans attended for decades until age made travel impossible. Their children attend now. Their grandchildren attend. The town maintains a museum dedicated to the battle. McAuliffe's reply is prominently featured. Local guides tell the story to visitors. They explain what nuts means in American slang. They explain why it mattered. They explain how the reply affected the battle. The story has been told in dozens of books about World War II. It appears in every history of the Battle of the Bulge. It has been dramatized in films and television shows. It has been referenced in popular culture. It has become one of those rare historical moments that transcends military history and becomes part of broader cultural knowledge. People who know nothing else about the Battle of the Bulge know that an American general told the Germans nuts. The reason the story endures is because it captures something essential about how Americans see themselves: informal, direct, refusing to be intimidated, confident even in desperate situations. The reply was not planned. It was not calculated. It was spontaneous. That made it authentic. McAuliffe did not try to craft a clever response for history. He just said what he thought. That authenticity resonates. The story also endures because it worked. McAuliffe's confidence was justified. The 101st Airborne did hold Bastogne. Relief did arrive. The German offensive did fail. The bold reply was backed up by bold action. That combination of attitude and achievement is what makes the story compelling. It was not empty bravado. It was confidence based on real capability. The Germans learned something at Bastogne that they should have learned earlier. They learned that surrounding American forces did not guarantee their surrender. They learned that cutting supply lines did not guarantee American collapse. They learned that outnumbering Americans did not guarantee victory. American forces would fight when surrounded. They would fight when outnumbered. They would fight when cut off from supply. They would keep fighting until they won or until they were physically unable to continue. That was different from what German commanders had assumed based on early encounters with green American troops. The reply also demonstrated something about military culture. The German military operated on formal protocol and clear hierarchy. Communication between commanders was structured and proper. The American military was more flexible and informal. That informality could be a strength. It allowed for faster decision-making. It allowed for unconventional approaches. It meant American commanders could respond to situations in ways German commanders did not anticipate, because those responses fell outside established military protocol. McAuliffe sending a one-word slang reply to a formal surrender ultimatum was exactly that kind of unconventional response. It violated protocol. It worked anyway. Modern military leaders still study Bastogne. They study the tactical decisions. They study the logistics. They study the defensive positions. But they also study the psychology. They study how McAuliffe maintained morale in desperate circumstances. They study how he projected confidence when the situation looked hopeless. They study how a simple message, delivered at the right time, in the right way, could influence the outcome of a battle. That lesson transcends the specific details of World War II. Leadership under pressure remains relevant regardless of the era or the technology. The story of nuts has become a teaching point about communication. Military academies use it as an example. Business schools use it as an example. Leadership courses use it as an example. The lesson is about clarity and confidence. When McAuliffe said nuts, everyone understood exactly what he meant. There was no ambiguity. There was no room for misinterpretation. The message was clear. The confidence behind it was clear. That clarity and confidence shaped how everyone who heard it responded. American soldiers were inspired. German officers were confused. Both reactions influenced the battle. That is how leadership actually works in crisis situations. Not through careful planning and formal protocols, though those matter, but through individuals who understand what needs to be communicated and find the most effective way to communicate it. McAuliffe understood that his troops needed to know their commander was not worried. They needed to know surrender was not being considered. They needed to know he believed they would hold. He communicated all of that in one word. That was effective leadership. If you found this story compelling, please take a moment to like this video. It helps us share more forgotten and remarkable moments from the Second World War. Subscribe to stay connected with these important histories. Each one reveals something essential about how the war was actually fought and won. We would love to hear from you in the comments. Tell us where you are watching from, and if you have family connections to Bastogne or the Battle of the Bulge, please share those stories. Our community stretches across continents and generations, from veterans to students, all united by respect for these incredible moments in history. Thank you for watching, and thank you for helping keep these memories alive.